FSB Razorback was not a place built for defense. It was a scar cut into the jungle's throat, and by October 1968, the monsoon was trying to stitch the wound closed with water and mud. Sergeant Reyes, Marine Corps, 3rd Tour, stared at the lip of the bunker, now merely a sloping chute of slick, ochre clay leading down to a pit of freezing brown sludge. They hadn't seen a large-scale assault in 17 days, but the waiting had become a kinetic action all its own. The duality here was insidious. The absence of contact was infinitely more terrifying than the brief, clean chaos of a mortar barrage. Combat was finite. This waiting was eternal, stretching the sanity like old rubber. Reyes felt the weight of the water in his bones. Every sandbag was sodden, every trench line half-submerged. The M16s gummed up in minutes. The radio batteries, perpetually damp, whistled with static that sounded less like equipment failure and more like faint, mocking laughter echoing off the jungle canopy. Razorback was supposed to be a blocking position against infiltration from the A Shau, but now it felt like a cork stuck deep in a muddy bottle, the pressure building, but the cap refusing to blow. The men moved like specters, wrapped in mildewed ponchos, their faces drawn tight, not from sleep deprivation. They slept fitfully, but from the continuous, high-pitched sensory assault of the environment. The sound was the rain, the smell was decay. The feel was cold, constant wetness. Reyes remembered the fire and fury of Key sand. At least that had been honest. This was a slow, deliberate drowning. He watched Private Frobisher, newly arrived, meticulously cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that shift, polishing a spot of rust that wasn't there. Frobisher looked up, his eyes wide and vacant. "Sarge," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain on the corrugated roof. The wires singing again. Reyes didn't need to ask what he meant. The wind hitting the stretched tripwires sometimes made an eerie, harmonic sound. The sound of the perimeter itself humming under pressure. But Frobisher wasn't hearing the wind. He was hearing the line between life and death dissolving in the wet night air, knowing that line was all that separated them from whatever quiet horror lurked beyond the final concertina coil. It was the silence between the gusts of wind that made the men truly jump, a silence that meant the rain had paused and the enemy was surely moving. The singing wire was soon proven to be far more than auditory hallucination. Reyes conducted a harrowing perimeter check at 0:30, moving on his belly through 3 feet of waterlogged, oil-slicked earth. What he found wasn't a hole blown by an explosive or a crude break made by wire cutters. It was artistry. 30 meters past the first apron of concertina, a single strand of wire had been meticulously and subtly stretched and pinned back into the mud, then reset after passage with tiny bamboo splints, camouflaged with moss and mud so perfectly that only the minute tension change in the slack could betray the passage. It wasn't a breach designed for assault. It was a breach for observation. They were being walked around, cataloged, assessed. The horror wasn't the violence. It was the intimate, invasive knowledge the enemy was gaining. This happened in 3 separate places within a 100-meter stretch. Reyes signaled Frosty back to the main bunker, his heart pounding a dull, suffocating rhythm against his ribs. The patrol reports over the last 2 weeks have been dismissed as paranoia. Shadows moving too quickly, the faint smell of tobacco where no Marines smoked, the distant clicking sound of something metallic being adjusted. Now Reyes understood. The NVA wasn't massing for a frontal attack. They were conducting an operation of pure psychological disassembly. The objective wasn't to kill them with bullets, but to break them with certainty that they were never alone, never secure, and always under the silent, knowing gaze of a foe who moved through their defenses like a ghost through paper walls. They weren't fighting the jungle. The jungle was fighting for the enemy. Reyes knelt in the mud, examining the expertly repinned wire. He knew how long this took, hours of painstaking work under cover of the storm. The enemy had been within spitting distance of their primary fighting positions for days, perhaps weeks, documenting their routines, listening to their fears, noting the weakest links. He ordered a complete overhaul of the claymore orientation, setting them to detonate on vibration rather than tripwire, a desperate measure against the phantom feet that trod the perimeter at night. But the security was already shattered, replaced by a cold, internal dread. The enemy had not spent one bullet, yet they had already conquered the most vital ground, the minds of the men defending Razorback. The Whisper campaign began in earnest the following morning, escalating the sense of pervasive violation. It started small. 3 days' worth of K-rations were found neatly stacked, but every plastic wrapper was punctured with microscopic holes, rendering the food soggy and rancid. A jerry can of precious diesel was found drained, the valve carefully replaced, leaving no telltale sign of tampering except the absence of fuel. Then came the chilling precision. Doc Chambers' medical kit was infiltrated. Specific ampoules of morphine were replaced with saline solution. It wasn't random theft. It was targeted sabotage designed to undermine confidence in survival resources and internal trust. Reyes felt the atmosphere tighten, becoming brittle. The men stopped talking above whispers, fearing that any loud word might reveal a critical weakness to the invisible listener. They started eyeing each other, wondering how someone could slip past the rotations without the man on watch hearing. Was it a lapse in duty, or was the infiltrator simply impossible to detect? The most unnerving incident involved the primary field radio, the RT-524. Maintenance had cleaned it daily, but it suddenly failed during the scheduled comms check. When Corporal Vance stripped it down, he found 3 grains of dry rice meticulously pressed into the main frequency selector switch. It was a clear, unmistakable signature. The rice was a symbol of insult and presence, a declaration that the enemy moved freely among them, leaving calling cards. The emotional contagion was instant and toxic. Reyes realized the NVA wasn't just trying to disrupt their supplies. They were attempting to manufacture paranoia that would turn the Marines against themselves. Who would have rice? Only someone who had brought it in, perhaps someone who had traded with the locals, or worse, someone who had been compromised or turned. The quiet horror was the knowledge that the perimeter was meaningless, that the true threat might be within the close confines of the bunker, shared air thick with suspicion and the smell of fear. The storm raged outside, drowning out the noises of the jungle. But in the silence between thunderclaps, the Marines listened not for incoming rounds, but for the subtle shift in breathing, the faint click that might signify a knife being drawn by the man, sleeping 2 feet away. The enemy had successfully weaponized doubt. Razorback had always smelled bad: cordite, sweat, mildew, and wet earth. But in the last week of the unending rain, a new scent began to dominate. The sickly sweet, cloying aroma of decay, like a grave disturbed but not fully opened. It clung to the humid air, thick and oppressive, overriding even the stench of their own unwashed bodies. Reyes initially dismissed it as a dead animal, perhaps a bloated pig washed down the ravine. But the smell persisted, concentrated around the lowest points of the perimeter near the main observation post. During a desperate attempt to deepen the sump trench, Corporal Vance's shovel hit something hollow. It wasn't hard ground. It was an extremely well-concealed spider hole, lined meticulously with woven bamboo and reinforced with salvaged ration crates, positioned barely 5 meters outside their primary fighting bunker. Reyes had the men excavated. It led to a narrow, muddy tunnel network running horizontally just under the surface of the mud, extending far back into the jungle. This wasn't a new tunnel. The earth around the entrance was heavily compacted and seasoned. The odor of decay was overwhelming inside the shaft. It wasn't human decomposition, but the smell of long-term biological refuse, the accumulated waste of someone living there, possibly for weeks, maybe even months, observing the base from below the mud line. The tunnel network confirmed their worst fear. The NVA sappers hadn't just infiltrated the base. They had effectively colonized the ground beneath it. They weren't just watching, they were residing. The silence wasn't due to the enemy being distant. It was due to the enemy being right beneath their feet, moving in ways that the sensory overload of the rain and the mud naturally masked. The emotional impact was shattering. It meant that every conversation, every desperate plea for extraction, every moment of fear or relief had been overheard and filed away. The ground they fought so hard to hold was fundamentally insecure, literally honeycombed with the eyes and ears of the adversary. Reyes leaned against the wet lip of the exposed hole, the heavy, sweet scent filling his lungs. He felt physically contaminated, realizing that the very earth they walked on was the enemy's sanctuary, transforming the quiet horror from external observation into internal violation. Doc Chambers, a Navy corpsman who had seen men blown apart and patched them back together, found himself facing an enemy he couldn't treat with sutures or morphine. He was diagnosing outbreaks of mud fever, his term for the acute psychological toll of Razorback's static defense. It wasn't malaria or jungle rot. It was paranoia induced by the sensory environment and the persistent sabotage. His official reports were vague. High incidence of insomnia, severe auditory sensitivity, and psychosomatic illnesses. The men developing sudden, debilitating stomach cramps whenever a radio crackled or the rain briefly stopped. He warned Reyes that the men were near the breaking point, but the catalyst wouldn't be a firefight. "Sarge," Doc muttered, checking the trembling hands of a private named Johnson. "The kinetic fight, the bullets, the incoming rounds, those provide a goal. You dodge, you fight back, you survive. It's clean in its horror. But this lack of definition, the constant awareness of being watched, the mud covering everything, it's erasing their cognitive boundaries. They can't trust the perimeter, the supplies, or their own senses. They're exhausting themselves internally trying to locate the threat that they know is 5 feet away, but remains invisible. Their brains are frying, Sarge. They're manufacturing combat just to get the release. If we don't get hit soon or get pulled out, someone's going to turn the violence inward or against his own." Chambers pointed to the stats. The rate of accidental discharges was spiking, as were self-inflicted injuries disguised as accidents. The men were subconsciously seeking escape, seeking a wound that would send them far away from the omnipresent, silent trackers. Chambers stressed that the NVA had achieved a victory far greater than any successful overrun. They had created a battlefield where the enemy's main weapon was the doubt sown into the American mind. When the physical body is battered, the will endures. When the mind is systematically undermined by the horror of the unseen, the will evaporates. Razorback was becoming a psychiatric ward carved out of the Vietnamese hillside, and the only cure was extraction, a cure which, given their isolation, remained impossible. Private Frobisher, the young Marine Reyes had seen polishing the non-existent rust, was now the unit's designated listener. Detailed to the post nearest the newly discovered tunnel network, armed only with a highly sensitive acoustic dish and an M16. He had become the focal point of the quiet horror. The constant, soft static of the monsoon, amplified by the dish, morphed into something intelligible in his exhausted mind. He started reporting whispers, not enemy commands, which would have been comforting, but personal, intimate details. "Sarge, I heard them again," Frosty reported one miserable afternoon, his voice thin and shaky. "They were talking about my sister's dog, Barnaby. How he only had 3 legs after that car accident in '64. They were mocking the limp." Reyes stared, stunned by the specificity. Frosty had never mentioned Barnaby to anyone in the unit. It was too irrelevant, too painful a detail to share in the context of war. The only way the enemy could know that detail was through long-term, sophisticated intelligence gathering. Intercepting letters, perhaps, or exploiting capture documents from previous battles, linking personal lives to individuals now defending Razorback. The realization that the enemy had bridged the thousands of miles between his family home and this muddy bunker, using personal vulnerabilities as psychological weapons, broke Frobisher's final tether to reality. The horror wasn't generic. It was hyper-specific, invasive, and tailored. Frosty began to argue back at the static, shouting incoherent challenges into the rain-swept jungle, convinced the trackers were reciting his childhood history, mocking his failures and deepest fears. Reyes tried to pull him off the post, but Frosty fought, convinced that the mud itself held the microphones, that the water was broadcasting the voices. He saw the enemy not as soldiers in black pajamas, but as a vast, sentient network of observation. When Reyes finally restrained him, Frosty was crying not from fear of dying, but from the unbearable shame of having his intimate life exposed and used against him in this desolate, wet corner of the world. The lesson was clear. The NVA didn't need to kill them. They needed to destroy their sense of private self, turning the Marines into stripped-down, exposed data points in a terrifying, personalized psychological war. During a brief, agonizing hour when the rain receded to a mere drizzle, Reyes led the most dangerous mission yet. 3 men crossing the wire to investigate the exact infiltration route. They moved in low, slithering over the slick clay, their adrenaline spiked, not by the fear of contact, but the profound certainty of being watched. When they reached the perimeter gap Reyes had initially found, they followed the almost invisible trail of depressed mud. What they discovered was not evidence of a quick dash, but a network of acoustic and psychological traps. Embedded in the mud, barely visible, were dozens of expertly crafted bamboo apparatuses, miniature musical instruments, essentially. Thin, taut strands of silk or hair were stretched across hollowed-out gourds, connected to tiny levers. When the wind blew at a specific velocity, or when a slight vibration occurred, like a man stopping too suddenly, the levers moved, causing the gourds to emit faint, irregular, non-natural sounds. High-pitched clicks, metallic snaps, or soft, rhythmic thrumming. These devices were not booby traps. They were acoustic torture devices, carefully placed just far enough away to be mistaken for normal jungle noises or the internal noise of the Marines' own failing equipment. They were designed to drive auditory fatigue, to make the men doubt the sanity of what they were hearing, perfectly explaining Frobisher's descent. Reyes understood the sophisticated logic. These trackers were generating phantom noises that would force the Marines to strain their ears against the monsoon, leading to exhaustion, panic, and self-doubt. They also found small caches of American cigarette butts, crushed perfectly flat, positioned strategically near the observation points. A clear message that the enemy had been sitting there, smoking the cigarettes they had likely stolen days earlier, enjoying the show. The true terror was the realization of the NVA's patience and strategic depth. They weren't rushing to kill. They were meticulously eroding the Marines' grip on reality, weaponizing the sensory chaos of the jungle itself. The silence between the manufactured sounds was the loudest weapon they possessed. The combat, when it finally arrived, was short, brutal, and served only to underscore the psychological nature of the entire operation. It happened during a rotating watch change near the north end. Corporal Vance was standing up, shaking out his perpetually wet poncho, his profile silhouetted briefly against the gray, watery sky. There was a sound, not the tearing report of an AK-47, but a sharp, clean crack that echoed strangely across the muddy basin, too loud and too fast. Vance slumped forward, collapsing silently into the mud, a single, precise entry wound high on his chest. Before Reyes could even fully shout a warning, the sound had vanished. The jungle, already saturated with the constant drumming of the rain, swallowed the event whole. There was no follow-up fire, no burst of automatic weapons, no mortar rounds to capitalize on the shock. Just one bullet, perfectly placed, followed by an immediate, profound silence. The sniper, or team, had fired a single round and instantly vanished back into the tree-line, confirming their complete control over the engagement envelope. Reyes crawled out to Vance, dragging the limp body back through the mud, the rain washing the blood away almost immediately. The incident was a declaration. We can kill you anytime, anywhere, with perfect impunity, but we choose not to. We choose to let you wait instead. The act wasn't about reducing their numbers. It was about maximizing the psychological impact of randomness. Why Vance? Why now? Why only one shot? The arbitrary nature of the death drove the men further into despair. They couldn't fight back against a ghost that appeared only to deliver one fatal message and then dissolve into the foliage. The silence that followed the single shot was absolute, terrifying, and heavier than any barrage. It was the sound of the enemy resetting the timer on their slow-motion execution, ensuring that every Marine now knew that his individual death warrant had been signed, and only the timing remained uncertain. The horror wasn't the projectile. It was the deliberate, unnerving vacuum left behind by the perfectly executed, minimalist attack. The accumulated quiet horror finally detonated in Private Frobisher. Late that night, convinced that the mud had achieved full sentience and was relaying his position, thoughts, and past errors to the unseen enemy, he snapped. He didn't run towards the wire. He ran towards the central ammunition bunker, screaming a distorted mixture of profanity and childhood prayers. He grabbed 2 cans of jellied gasoline, meant for flamethrowers, and sprinted back towards the perimeter, shouting, "Stop listening! Shut up! I can't hear myself think." Reyes and Doc Chambers reacted instantly, tackling Frobisher just as he reached the first apron of concertina. Frobisher fought with maniacal strength, his eyes fixed on the mud, tears streaming down his face. He was trying to ignite the fuel, convinced that only fire could sterilize the listening earth and burn away the invisible eyes. Reyes struggled to pin him, feeling the sharp, protruding bones of the young man, realizing Frobisher was starved not of food, but of safety and silence. As Frobisher finally lay subdued, gasping for breath, he pointed to the wire, his voice hoarse. "They know about the letter, Sarge, the one I never sent. They read it. They read everything." Doc Chambers injected him with a heavy sedative. As Frobisher drifted toward unconsciousness, the look in his eyes was not of terror, but profound, exhausted relief. He was finally escaping the psychological prison the NVA had constructed. The silent trackers had achieved their goal without a major offensive. They hadn't killed Frobisher with bullets, but they had effectively removed him from the fight, leaving behind a husk of paranoid exhaustion. Reyes looked out at the rain, which had picked up again, drowning the scene in gray noise. He understood the horrifying victory. Frobisher's breakdown was more potent than an enemy platoon penetrating the wire. It was proof that the quiet, sustained psychological pressure of the unseen had achieved what direct combat rarely could: the complete mental dissolution of a fighting man, making the whole unit question the reality they were desperately clinging to. Dawn finally brought a brief, pale light, exposing the miserable, waterlogged state of Razorback. The rain stopped, leaving behind a silence so unnerving it felt louder than the previous storm. The long-awaited reinforcement platoon finally arrived, not as a triumphant spearhead, but in slow, cautious increments, struggling with the mud that had devoured the base. They were greeted not by defiant defenders, but by hollow-eyed men moving like automata, obsessively wiping non-existent mud from their weapons, talking in hushed, jerky sentences. Reyes supervised the evacuation of the psychologically compromised, including Frosty, strapped securely to a stretcher, now clinically catatonic. As Reyes prepared to leave the base, handing command to the arriving lieutenant, he surveyed the perimeter one last time. He saw the expertly repinned wire, the faint outline of the collapsed tunnel entrance, and the disturbed earth where Vance had fallen. He realized the most persistent echo of Razorback would not be the roar of artillery or the whiz of passing rounds, but the oppressive, wet silence that always preceded the discovery of a new intrusion. He left the hill, feeling profoundly clean of the physical dirt, but irrevocably contaminated by the certainty that he had been entirely observed, measured, and judged by an enemy that preferred the subtle art of patience and psychological warfare over the brutality of direct fire. Razorback wasn't a firebase. It was a sensory deprivation chamber designed to make Marines question the integrity of their own minds. Reyes carried with him not the trauma of explosions, but the suffocating memory of being perpetually tracked, the cold knowledge that somewhere, right now, someone was reading the unspoken anxieties of the man watching the wire, preparing the next subtle move in a war where the greatest wound was the realization that the silent enemy knew you better than you knew yourself.